Sunday, June 18, 1815 marked the end of an era. On the fields near the Belgian village of Waterloo, under a heavy wet sky, the fate of Europe was decided. Emperor Napoleon, who had returned from Elba for 100 days, risked everything in a last desperate attempt to regain his throne. Opposing him was the army of the Seventh Coalition, British, Dutch, and German troops under the command of the Duke of Wellington, awaiting the arrival of Prussian Field Marshal Blücher. In our history, this day ended with the defeat of the French Guard and the Emperor's flight. Waterloo became not just a military event, but a cultural symbol, a feature that summed up the French Revolution and the 20 years of almost continuous warfare that followed it. But the outcome of this battle was not a foregone conclusion. The Duke of Wellington himself called the battle the closest thing you have ever seen in your life. The victory of the coalition hung in the balance. All day long, the British center endured inhuman tension. What if one element of this complex mosaic had shifted? What if the weather, tactics, or simply luck had swung the other way? This is a scenario in which Wellington's close call turns into his defeat, and Emperor Napoleon remains the master of the battlefield. Watch the video to the end to find out how the story of Napoleon's victory at Waterloo could have changed. What if events had unfolded differently? To understand the scale of the alternative, it is necessary to look at the real situation in the spring of 1815. Napoleon's return from Elba on March 1st was a miracle of improvisation and personal charisma. He landed in France with a handful of guards and, without firing a single shot, entered Paris 20 days later. King Louis XIV fled. However, the triumph was exclusively internal. To the outside world, Napoleon was the enemy of humanity. Europe, gathered at the Congress of Vienna to rebuild the world after the wars, reacted instantly and unanimously. The four great powers, Great Britain, Austria, Prussia, and Russia, reaffirmed their alliance commitments, known as the Seventh Coalition. They pledged to field hundreds of thousands of soldiers to remove Napoleon from power, by force if necessary. There was no intention of negotiating peace with him. Napoleon found himself in a position he had never been in before. He was alone against everyone. France itself was exhausted. 20 years of war had depleted its population. The enthusiasm of the revolutionary years had long since faded, giving way to weariness from endless conscription into the army. The economy had been undermined by the Continental blockade, and the British Navy still controlled the sea lanes. Although the army, especially the veterans, idolized the emperor, French society as a whole, the bourgeoisie, the peasants, the old aristocracy, craved peace, not new glory. The military machine that Napoleon was able to assemble in the 100 days was impressive for such a short period, about 280,000 men, but it was no match for the resources of the coalition, which planned to mobilize more than 1 million soldiers. Napoleon had only one chance to act preemptively. He had to defeat the Allied armies stationed in Belgium, Wellington and Blücher, one by one before the Austrians and Russians reached the Rhine. He almost succeeded. On June 16th, he attacked the Prussians at Ligny and forced them to retreat. But Blücher's retreat did not turn into a rout. Napoleon assigned a 33,000-strong corps under the command of Marshal Grouchy to pursue the Prussians, which proved to be a fateful decision. He himself turned against Wellington, who had taken up defensive positions at Waterloo. Napoleon was confident that Grouchy would tie up Blücher, leaving him to deal only with the Anglo-Dutch army. The reality on June 18th was different. Grouchy got bogged down in a tactically pointless battle at Wavre, fighting the Prussian rearguard, while Blücher's main army was marching to join Wellington. Napoleon attacked Wellington's center all day long. He captured the key farm of La Haye-Sainte too late when the Prussians had already struck his flank. This made defeat inevitable. But what if one detail in this chain had changed? Subscribe so you don't miss other alternative versions of history. Let's imagine for a moment that the chain of events on June 18, 1815, unfolds with a subtle but decisive shift. We won't introduce miracles or change the weather. The famous morning rain that softened the ground and forced Napoleon to postpone his attack remains a fact. However, one tactical decision, one time interval, changes. The Battle of Waterloo was a series of crises, and Wellington's center, held with the last of its strength, was close to collapse. In our story, the La Sainte Farm, the key to Wellington's center, fell around 6:30 p.m., but Marshal Ney, encouraged by this success, did not receive reinforcements for the decisive blow. Napoleon already saw Blücher's Prussians on his flank and threw his reserves, the Young Guard, at them. What if Ney's attack on the farm, undertaken earlier in the day, had been better organized? Let's assume that Durland's corps had not been so senselessly wasted in the first attack, and that the supporting artillery had been deployed more effectively. In this scenario, La Sainte falls not at 6:30 p.m., but 2 hours earlier, around 4:30 p.m. At this point, Blücher's Prussian army is just appearing on the horizon, but does not pose an immediate threat to the flank. The fall of La Sainte opens a breach in Wellington's center. Seeing this, Napoleon makes a different decision. He does not hesitate. Instead of waiting, he throws not the Young Guard, but the entire Old Guard, his last and main reserve, into this breach. Wellington has nothing left to counter this blow. His famous squares, effective against cavalry, are powerless against the concentrated attack of elite infantry supported by artillery. The center of the British army is broken. The lines of command are disrupted. What had been organized resistance turns into a hasty retreat. Wellington is forced to give the order to retreat in order to save the army from complete destruction. At the same time, Blücher's vanguard, seeing that Wellington's army is defeated and retreating, and the French army, inspired by victory, is turning towards them, stops its advance. The Prussians, themselves barely recovered from Ligny, did not risk engaging in battle alone against the victorious Napoleon. They withdrew to the east to regroup. By the evening of June 18, Napoleon remained master of the battlefield. He spent the night in Brussels. Victory, albeit at a high price, had been achieved. The victory at Waterloo would have an immediate and resounding effect, primarily on domestic politics. In Paris, the news of Wellington and Blücher's defeat would cause an explosion of popular jubilation. The whole city, which just a few days earlier had been anxiously awaiting news, would be illuminated. The bourgeoisie and liberals, grouped around figures such as Fouché, who were already preparing a plan to depose Napoleon in the event of defeat, would immediately swear allegiance to the emperor. The Chamber of Deputies, previously opposed to him, would have voted for any credits and laws necessary to continue the war. Napoleon's authority, restored by the miracle of his return from Elba, would now have been reinforced by the miracle of victory over two great armies. All of France would have rallied around him. This would have given him the opportunity to carry out a new total mobilization, putting hundreds of thousands more soldiers at his disposal, even if they were untrained. However, outside France, there would be no euphoria. Wellington, although defeated, would not have been completely destroyed. He would have retreated with his army to the coast, to Antwerp or Ostend, under the protection of the British fleet. Blücher's Prussians would have joined forces with other Prussian corps. The Seventh Coalition would perhaps have been shocked, but not broken. Great Britain, master of the seas and banker of the coalition, would not have agreed to peace. For London, it would have been only a lost battle, not a lost war. The main problem for Napoleon was that Waterloo was only a prelude. He had defeated the vanguard of the coalition, but the main forces were still on the march. The news of Napoleon's victory would have caught the Austrian army of Field Marshal Schwarzenberg, more than 200,000 men, and the Russian army of Field Marshal Barclay de Tolly, more than 250,000 men, on their way to the Rhine. They would not have stopped. They would only have accelerated their advance, knowing that they would now have to deal with Napoleon at the height of his genius. The victory gave Napoleon an invaluable resource, time and the moral advantage. But it did not change the fundamental strategic situation. France remained alone against all of Europe. The emperor had gained a month, perhaps two. Now he had to solve an impossible task: how to stop a million-strong army advancing from the east with an army that, though inspired, had already suffered losses. The Blitzkrieg in Belgium was over, and a long war of attrition was beginning. This section analyzes the resources of the parties that determine the long-term outcome of the campaign. Napoleon's victory at Waterloo would have been a tactical triumph, but it could not change the strategic, economic, and demographic imbalance that had developed by 1815. France was deeply exhausted by more than 2 decades of almost continuous warfare. The human resources that had seemed inexhaustible in the 1790s were now depleted. The losses in the disastrous Russian campaign of 1812 and then in the Battle of the Nations at Leipzig in 1813 were irreplaceable. These were losses not only in men, but also in horses, which were critical for the cavalry and artillery, and in experienced personnel, officers and non-commissioned officers. The army of 1815 was merely a shadow of the Grande Armée of 1805. Although veterans returning from captivity formed its core, most of the soldiers were inexperienced recruits. The financial situation was no better. The treasury was empty. To finance the 100 Days Army, Napoleon had to resort to emergency loans and defaults. The agriculture-based economy could not compete with the industrial and financial power of Great Britain. The British pound, not the French franc, was the currency with which the coalition waged war. London financed the armies of Russia, Prussia, and Austria, providing subsidies that allowed them to keep their armies in the field. A key factor was the British blockade. The Royal Navy ruled the seas unchallenged. This meant that France was cut off from overseas trade, colonial raw materials, and the ability to import essential goods. The continental blockade, which Napoleon had previously used to try to strangle Britain, now worked against him. While the Allies could obtain weapons, ammunition, and resources from England via the ports of Antwerp or Hamburg, France could only rely on its own depleted manufacturing capacity. In the long run, Napoleon could not win a war of attrition. His only chance was to inflict such a defeat on the coalition with quick, decisive blows that its members, primarily Austria and Russia, would be forced to sit down at the negotiating table. But the Allies had already learned their lesson from 1805. Their strategy, agreed upon as early as 1814, was to avoid direct battles with Napoleon himself, but to attack his marshals, retreat, and let vast distances and logistics do their work. The victory at Waterloo, glorious though it was, immediately confronted Napoleon with a new, even more monumental threat. Having won the battle in Belgium, he was forced to immediately transfer his army eastward to the Rhine. The Austrians under Schwarzenberg and the Russians under Barclay de Tolly had already crossed the river and invaded Alsace and Lorraine. This was no longer the indecisive Austrian army of Austerlitz. These were hardened veterans who had just taken Paris in 1814. The emperor would have been forced to employ his favorite strategy, a strike in the center. He would have tried to wedge himself between Schwarzenberg's and Barclay's armies in order to defeat them one by one. This would probably have led to a series of brilliant but bloody battles reminiscent of his virtuoso six-day campaign of 1814. He might even have won a few battles, pushing the Austrians back behind the Black Forest or defeating the Russian vanguard. However, the fundamental problem remained. With their overwhelming numerical superiority, the Allies could afford to lose men and territory. Their strategy, developed as early as 1813, was to simply retreat before Napoleon's main attack, while their other armies, such as the Prussians, reinforced by Wellington in the north, would strike at his stretched communications or attack his marshals. The French army would melt away in these fruitless victories. Moreover, the political landscape of Germany had changed. In 1806, Napoleon had acted as a liberator for many German states by creating the Confederation of the Rhine. In 1815, he was an invader. All of Germany was swept up in a wave of patriotic fervor that we would call nationalism. German states, even former allies such as Bavaria and Württemberg, were now fighting against him. He would be waging war in hostile territory without reliable allies. The likely outcome of this 1816 campaign would have been a new, grandiose Battle of the Nations, a second Battle of Leipzig, somewhere in the Mainz or Strasbourg area. Napoleon, surrounded on all sides by superior forces, would have been forced to accept battle. Even his genius could not compensate for the lack of soldiers, artillery, and most importantly, the fatigue of the nation. This battle would most likely have ended the same way as the real Leipzig, with heroic resistance and complete defeat. The victory at Waterloo would only have delayed the inevitable for a year. But let's imagine for a moment a different, less likely but more interesting scenario. What if the victory at Waterloo had broken the will of the coalition? Let's say that Napoleon, having defeated Wellington, immediately rushed eastward and in a swift and brilliant campaign, inflicted a serious defeat on the Austrians even before the Russians arrived. Discord could have broken out in the Allies' camp. Emperor Alexander III, a man of a mystical disposition, might have seen this as God's providence. Austria, whose Emperor Francis I was Napoleon's father-in-law, had always been an opportunistic ally and feared the rise of Russia and Prussia above all else. Great Britain, true to its word, would insist on fighting to the end, but its land army would be taken out of the game. In this situation, a new Tilsit could take place. Metternich, realizing that the restoration of the Bourbons had failed again, could offer peace. The terms of this peace would have been harsh. Napoleon would have retained his throne, but France would probably have been returned to its natural borders of 1792, the Rhine, the Alps, the Pyrenees, or even 1789. He would have had to renounce all claims to Italy, Germany, and Holland. It would have been a peace based not on friendship, but on mutual exhaustion. Napoleon would have gotten France, and the coalition would have gotten the rest of Europe. Such an outcome would have fundamentally changed the concert of Europe. Instead of a completely defeated France ruled by the weak Bourbons, Europe would have had a restless, militarized France at its center, still ruled by the greatest military commander in history. It would not have been peace, but a 19th century Cold War. Great Britain, offended and distrustful of Napoleon, would never have recognized this peace as final. It would have continued its naval blockade and sought any excuse to create an eighth coalition. Within France, Napoleon would have been forced to rule on the basis of the Acte Additionnel, Additional Act, which he had adopted during the 100 Days. This document, written by the liberal Benjamin Constant, limited his power by creating a bicameral parliament. Thus, Napoleon, a despot by nature, would have found himself in the role of a constitutional monarch, constantly at odds with his liberal ministers. It would have been an internal war, no less difficult than the external one. In our story, Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo in 1815 paved the way for Britain and its long period of dominance known as the Pax Britannica. Britain established its dominance on the seas, its capital filled the world with railways, and the British system of diplomacy, the concert of Europe, created by Austria and its allies, ensured a fragile peace on the continent, suppressing revolutionary ideas, liberalism, and nationalism. In this system, France was weakened, and Prussia's role as a new power in Europe ultimately led to the unification of Germany. However, in an alternate reality where Napoleon wins at Waterloo and continues to rule, the world of the 19th century would look very different. In this world, there would be no concert of Europe as we know it. Instead, the continent would be divided into two ideological and military blocs, each seeking to dominate Europe: liberal, trade-oriented Britain and its allies at sea, versus authoritarian, continental France and its satellites. The world would be on the brink of constant conflict, and any local crisis could escalate into a large-scale European war as both blocs sought to assert their influence. One of the main arenas of this geopolitical rivalry would be the unification of Germany. In this world, Prussia, humiliated by Napoleon at the beginning of the century, would seek revenge. Support from Great Britain and Austria would allow Prussia to build up its power, which would inevitably lead to the German question being resolved much earlier than in our world. Instead of the gradual unification of Germany in the late 1800s, which took place under Prussian leadership, Napoleonic France under the Bonaparte would have established its influence over Germany, relying on southern Germany, states such as Bavaria and Württemberg, continuing the tradition of the Rhine Confederation. Napoleon might have sought to create a third Germany under French protectorate, opposing the resurgence of a powerful Prussia. This conflict would in any case have led to a German war much earlier, and with a completely different outcome. Colonial expansion in an alternate reality would also have been significantly different. In our world at the end of the 19th century, the scramble for Africa became one of the most important events of the era, during which European powers sought to divide and control the continent. However, if Napoleon had retained power, France under the Bonaparte would have pursued a much more aggressive colonial policy. Instead of catching up with Great Britain and making up for lost ground, as happened in real history, France and Great Britain would have become the two main competitors in the global colonial struggle. Napoleon would likely have competed with Britain for control of Egypt, India, and Indochina. These territories would have become not just a field for the exchange of goods and resources, but strategic points for the continuation of Anglo-French rivalry, which would have lasted for decades. The whole world would have turned into a chessboard for these two great powers, which would have fought for leadership in colonial affairs. Internally, France would also have undergone significant changes if Napoleon had won. In our history, France experienced two more revolutions in 1830 and 1848, the Second Republic, the Second Empire, under Napoleon III, Napoleon I's nephew, and finally the Third Republic. However, in an alternate reality, the Bonaparte dynasty could have consolidated its power much earlier, continuing to rule for decades. Napoleon II, son of Napoleon or the Eagle, would have survived and inherited the throne, ensuring the continuation of Bonaparte rule. France would most likely have become a liberal empire, with a more moderate policy than under Napoleon I, but would still have remained under the rule of a strong emperor. This liberal empire could have served as an example for other nations as a hybrid form of government, where there is a certain compromise between military power and liberal reforms. Napoleon II would have continued his father's policies, which focused on administrative reforms, economic development, and ensuring stability through centralized power. However, despite its stability and prosperity, France would remain under constant threat of a major war. Rivalry with Great Britain, attempts to restore French hegemony on the continent, and military conflicts with neighboring powers would inevitably lead to tensions that would prevent Europe from remaining at peace. When we move to the beginning of the 20th century in this alternative world, France, ruled by the Bonapartes, would have been the leading world power. There would be no Third Republic in Europe, and the French monarchy would continue to exist, perhaps within a more liberal political system, but with ever-increasing conflict with Great Britain and possibly other powers such as Russia or even the United States, which were becoming increasingly influential on the world stage. The world would have been stable, but it would not have been the stability we see today. In Europe, under French control, there would have been a peculiar balance of power in which the major powers, France and Great Britain, would not have ceased their struggle for world domination, including colonial issues, economic interests, and political influence. The story we have examined is an attempt to understand how fragile the world we know was. Napoleon's victory at Waterloo, even if it had been achieved, did not solve his main problem. All of Europe was against him, and France was exhausted. The most likely scenario would have been a one-year delay of defeat, until a new, even larger, Battle of the Nations on the Rhine. But even this delay would have changed history. However, if Napoleon had miraculously managed to retain his throne and make peace, the 19th century would have been unrecognizable. Instead of the Concert of Europe and Pax Britannica, based on France's defeat, we would have had a Cold War between Paris and London. There would have been no Bourbon Restoration, no revolutions of 1830 and 1848 in France as they happened. The fate of Germany, Italy, and the colonial world would have been completely different. Waterloo was not just a battle, it was a point at which history could have gone in one of two directions. Either a return to the balance of power of the old monarchies, or the continuation of the military dictatorship born of revolution. Europe chose the former. This scenario reminds us that the outcome of a single day, a single close call on a wet field in Belgium, truly shaped the contours of our modern world. Subscribe so you don't miss new versions of history